Hello there. It's February, and that means it's Black History Month. So we're going to do a short series for the month of February, 4 weeks long, on 4 different people involved in, civil rights history in the United States who often get overlooked or don't get as prominent a position in, our history when we learn about them. And we're going to start off the series today with Claudette Colvin. So a lot of people haven't heard of Claudette Colvin. She was kind of a Rosa Parks before Rosa Parks. Claudette Colvin, she was born in 1939. She's still alive today. She lived in Montgomery, Alabama during Jim Crow laws and segregation. So if you don't know, Jim Crow laws were these laws that forced segregation, as in separating people based on race, forcing a lot of black citizens to have to use worse facilities, be treated worse in public, have to follow special rules to keep them away from white people. Really terrible and unjust, and caused a lot of undue suffering for people. Claudette Colvin was a teenage activist. Her most famous act in the civil rights movement in Alabama and Montgomery, she did this while she was a teenager. And so that's a fun thing to know. And some of her inspirations that she's named were Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth. The reason we don't hear as much about Claudette Colvin is because we're too busy talking about Rosa Parks, who's kind of the face of the history in Montgomery and the bus boycotts, the woman who refused to give up her seat to a white person on the bus because she had paid her fare and it was her right to sit down. The thing is that Claudette Colvin, about 9 months before that, did the same thing. She was 15 years old. She bought her bus fare, sat down on the bus, and refused to give up her seat to a white person. Sounds familiar. And Claudette Colvin was arrested and put in jail. A 15-year-old. And so, a lot of the civil rights activists in Montgomery, including Martin Luther King Jr. and others, who were leading the movements there, were aware of what Claudette Colvin had done. I mean, she was in the news for it, she had been arrested, and they thought that what she had done was really inspiring, but leaders didn't think that she would be a good face for this Montgomery bus boycott movement because of 2 things. One, she was a teenager, and people said that teenagers were, less reliable than adults, and Rosa Parks was an adult. Another thing that happened was that Claudette Colvin got pregnant afterward, and so they were afraid to put her forward as a face of things because she was a young, unwed mother. So because she was young, and because she was unwed and pregnant, they decided, that Claudette Colvin wasn't the most upstanding person to be the face of this movement for justice. Which is unfortunate, because she did something really brave and hasn't gotten the credit for it. And so instead they chose Rosa Parks, who was older, who was an adult, who was more respectable. And so Rosa Parks is the one who has gone down in history as the one who refused to give up her seat. But that was kind of the plan for Rosa Parks to do that. Learning about Claudette Colvin and her actions makes you realize that Rosa Parks' act in refusing to give up her seat wasn't just a random one-off event. It was kind of orchestrated. She did that on purpose. Which just gives you some insight into the careful planning and preparation that activists had to do in order to fight against segregation and injustice in the South at the time. So a little bit about the Montgomery bus boycotts themselves. Those were a major way that black citizens and activists were able to put pressure on the system and on the people in power, because they straight up quit using public transportation. They didn't pay bus fares, and they just walked everywhere for a while. I mean, it was intense. It took a lot of commitment from everyone. It was a massive group effort, and because they weren't taking the bus, they weren't paying their fares, and because they weren't paying their fares to the bus had less money, the bus system had less money, the city government had less money. And so it was financial pressure, really, that was put on them. And people only agreed to ride the buses again once they were desegregated and people could sit down where they wanted to on the bus. And so it all came to a head at a Supreme Court case in Alabama called Browder versus Gale. So it was an important piece of history to know. It was the court case in which segregation on public transportation was ruled unconstitutional. So it was victory. The Montgomery bus boycott was successful in its goal of ending segregation on public transportation. And Claudette Colvin was one of the plaintiffs on the case. She was involved. She shared her story of injustice, of being literally handcuffed and put in jail because she just wanted to sit down on the bus. A cool quote, NPR did an interview of Claudette Colvin in 2009. I found the article. And a quote that she said, where she was talking about that one specific moment where she was on the bus and decided not to get up. She had talked about how she had been learning at school Black history. It was Black History Month when she was in school at the time. And she had been learning about historical Black figures that had come before her, like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. And she was learning about Black people's fight against oppression. And they even talked in school about how they were experiencing it through Jim Crow laws and segregation at school. And so she had kind of been energized by these lessons from school and learning about history and learning about important people who had fought for their rights. And she got on the bus that day, and about that day she said, "My head was just too full of Black history, the oppression that we went through. It felt like Sojourner Truth was on one side pushing me down and Harriet Tubman was on the other side of me pushing me down. I couldn't get up." So, talking about not being able to get up from the bus seat because those strong women who had gone before her were keeping her strong and holding her there, helping her stand her ground, I guess sit her ground because she was sitting, but you know what I mean. That's the important thing to know about Claudette Colvin, is that she was Rosa Parks before Rosa Parks was Rosa Parks. Claudette Colvin went first, and the only reason that she didn't get the attention was because of some of her circumstances that people decided would make her like a less sympathetic or lovable person due to being, one, so young, and two, getting pregnant as a teenager. But I think it's important to give credit where credit is due. And so that's why I want to remember Claudette Colvin and what she's done. And she's still alive today, so that puts in perspective a lot of these events weren't that long ago in history. And the fight for justice is still continuing in our country. There are still ways in which Black people experience oppression. So it's good to remember teenage activists, because it doesn't matter how young you are, you can still do something that makes a big difference. And with that, I'll just conclude with a verse from 1 Timothy that I think applies here. "Let no one despise your youth, but set the believers an example in speech and conduct, in love, in faith, in purity." You don't have to be an adult to set an example to people for how to live. Hope you all have a good week. Hope that you find a way to make a difference in your surroundings this week. And I hope you know that even though you're young, your actions are valid, your feelings are valid, and you can make an impact. Next week, we're going to look at Ruby Bridges. So stay tuned, and I'll see you next week.